Something changed overnight. Not in how you feel, though that's changing too, but in what your body is doing. For the first 7 days, your physiology was largely occupied with one task: clearing the immediate chemical damage of nicotine withdrawal, receptor desaturation, carboxyhemoglobin elimination, plasma fibrinogen normalization. The acute pharmacokinetic crisis is over. Day 8 is when the construction crews arrive. Your bronchial cilia, those microscopic hair-like projections lining your airways that smoke paralyzed for years, are now regenerating at a measurable rate. Their beat frequency has climbed to 60 to 70% of non-smoker baseline. Your alveolar macrophages, the immune sentinels of the lung that tar had turned sluggish and overwhelmed, are recovering phagocytic efficiency. Your C-reactive protein, the inflammation marker that runs 2 to 3 times higher in active smokers, is falling toward normal range. This isn't metaphor. This is what happens when you take the insult away and give human biology enough time to do what it does naturally. For the next 24 hours, hours 169 through 192, we're going to track it precisely. At hour 169, the first hour of day 8, your bronchial cilia are doing something they couldn't do a week ago. They're beating. Not all of them. Not at full capacity. But ciliary beat frequency is now approaching 60 to 70% of non-smoker baseline. Those are real numbers from pulmonary research on cessation timelines. The mucociliary escalator, the coordinated wave motion that moves the mucus blanket from your lower airways up toward your throat, is partially operational. If you've noticed an increase in productive cough this week, that's why. The clearance system is running again, moving debris that had accumulated when the cilia were paralyzed. This productive cough is not a problem. It is the repair. At hour 170, your C-reactive protein, a hepatic acute phase reactant that reflects systemic inflammation, is declining steadily. In active smokers, CRP runs 2 to 3 times above non-smoker normal. At day 8, that excess is measurably reduced. Reduced CRP translates directly into decreased cardiovascular event risk. Every point drop in CRP corresponds to real-world outcomes. Lower probability of coronary artery disease events, lower probability of stroke. By hours 171 and 172, your immune system is coming back online at 2 specific levels. First, your neutrophils, the white blood cells that are the body's first responders to bacterial infection, have recovered their chemotaxis and phagocytic function. Chronic nicotine suppressed their ability to migrate toward pathogens and engulf them. That suppression is lifting. Second, blood flow to your gingival tissue, your gums, is increasing as nicotine-induced vasoconstriction continues to resolve. Gum tissue oxygenation is improving. Periodontal healing is actively progressing. At hour 173, circulating endothelial progenitor cells are increasing in number. These are stem cell-like cells that home to sites of vascular damage. And there's plenty of vascular damage to repair after years of combustion byproduct exposure. Think of them as the repair crew being dispatched to specific injury sites in your arterial walls. By hours 174 through 176, insulin sensitivity is measurably improving as sympathetic nervous system hyperactivation from nicotine subsides. Dermal blood flow is increasing, which means your skin's fibroblasts are getting the oxygen they need to resume collagen synthesis. Your alveolar macrophages, the immune cells that live inside your air sacs, are recovering phagocytic efficiency. Their job is to clear inhaled particles and kill pathogens. Chronic tar exposure had burdened them with material they couldn't process. That cellular burden is starting to decrease. And at hour 177, something important is happening in your brain. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptor density, the excess receptors your brain built in response to years of overstimulation, is actively downregulating. The supraphysiological receptor count is coming down. Fewer receptors means fewer binding sites generating craving signals. Cravings at this stage typically last 2 to 3 minutes, rather than the 5 to 10 minutes you experienced in days 1 and 2. That reduction isn't subtle. It's the pharmacological consequence of receptor normalization. At hour 181, tonic dopamine levels in your nucleus accumbens are rising toward pre-addiction baseline. This matters more than most quit resources acknowledge. Natural rewards, food, social interaction, achievement produce dopamine responses. But in an active nicotine user, the reward system has been calibrated to nicotine as its primary input. Natural rewards feel blunted by comparison. At day 8, that calibration is shifting. Everyday pleasures are beginning to generate more satisfying dopaminergic responses. Food tastes slightly better. Music registers differently. Conversation carries more weight. This isn't psychological improvement, it's neurochemical recovery. At hour 182, natural killer cells, the immune system's surveillance units against virally infected and precancerous cells, are returning to normal cytotoxic activity. Nicotine's immunosuppressive effect on NK cells had reduced their ability to identify and destroy abnormal cells. That suppression is resolving. At hour 183, inflammatory cell infiltration in your bronchial epithelium is decreasing. Eosinophil and neutrophil counts in the airway tissue are declining. Chronic airway inflammation, the state your airways have been in for years, is resolving. At hour 184, platelet hyperaggregability, which chronic smoking maintained at elevated levels, continues to normalize. Your blood is becoming less prone to forming clots in places it shouldn't. By hour 185, your taste receptors are continuing to regenerate. The gustatory papillae on your tongue, damaged by chronic thermal and chemical exposure, are progressively recovering. Taste acuity for bitter, sweet, salty, sour, and umami is sharpening. You may notice this at meals. Things taste like more than they did. At hour 186, tumor necrosis factor alpha, a key pro-inflammatory cytokine chronically elevated by 30 to 50% in smokers, is declining. This reduction decreases systemic inflammatory signaling across multiple organ systems simultaneously. Inflammation is not a single-site phenomenon. When TNF-alpha falls, it affects every tissue that was carrying that inflammatory burden. At hour 187, dermal fibroblast collagen production is increasing. Matrix metalloproteinase activity, which smoking had elevated and which was actively degrading structural proteins in your skin, is normalizing. Your skin is beginning to rebuild. At hour 188, new neural pathways supporting non-smoking behavioral patterns are strengthening through repeated activation. Every time a trigger arose this week and you didn't smoke, you reinforced a new circuit. Synaptic connections in the prefrontal cortex associated with your alternative responses are consolidating. The brain is, literally, rewiring itself to not need what it used to reach for. And at hours 189 through 191, interleukin-6 is declining, goblet cell hyperplasia in your bronchial epithelium is beginning to reverse, and peripheral sensory nerve endings damaged by chronic smoke exposure are undergoing repair. Improved microcirculation to peripheral nerves supports remyelination. You may notice this as subtly improved tactile sensation, fingertips slightly more sensitive than they were. At hour 183, the clinical timeline notes something specific. The psychological identity shift from smoker who is quitting to non-smoker is beginning to take hold. This framing matters clinically. Research on cessation outcomes shows that self-identification as a non-smoker, rather than as an ex-smoker or someone who has quit, is a strong predictor of long-term abstinence. The distinction isn't trivial. "I used to smoke" describes what you were. "I'm a non-smoker" describes what you are. The physiological basis for this shift is real. Your brain's nicotinic receptor density is declining toward non-smoker levels. Your blood chemistry, your CRP, your fibrinogen, your platelet aggregation, your carboxyhemoglobin has already normalized across multiple markers. Your dopamine system is recalibrating away from nicotine as its primary reward signal. The biology is moving in one direction. The psychology needs to follow. You don't need willpower to remain a non-smoker at day 8. The acute physiological demand, the receptor-driven craving signal, is functionally resolved. What remains are conditioned responses. Triggers that activate the old circuit by association. These weaken every time the trigger fires and the response doesn't follow. Day 8 is where the rebuilding is undeniable. The question is whether you're watching it happen. Hour 192. 8 full days without nicotine. In clinical terms, systemic inflammation markers are measurably reduced. Ciliary function is substantially recovered, and immune cell activity is approaching non-smoker baselines. That's the clinical summary. What it means in practice is that the body you're operating in right now is measurably different from the body you were operating in on day one, across multiple systems, simultaneously. Ciliary beat frequency at 60 to 70% of normal. Neutrophil chemotaxis restored. NK cell activity normalizing. Alveolar macrophage phagocytic efficiency recovering. CRP declining. Platelet aggregation normalizing. TNF-alpha falling. Dopamine baseline rising. Those are 8 separate physiological measurements. All of them improved. All of them measurable. None of them contingent on how you feel about having quit. The body doesn't wait for motivation. It just repairs. Day 9 brings surfactant normalization in the alveoli, vascular endothelial repair, cerebral blood flow improvement, and the beginning of serotonin pathway recovery. The neurological healing deepens. The tissue